What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about overrated bands. But just to be clear, this is not my personal list of bands that get excessive praise and attention and people just gush about for no apparent reason. No, this is your list of those bands. I asked on Twitter, these are the bands that you told me are overrated. And so in this video, I will go down that list and do my best to objectively answer that question. Are these bands really overrated, or are you guys just being haters? But first, if you haven't, check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific, and there's a link to that in the description of this video. And first up, we have by far the number one answer, which is the Beatles.
I love them. I don't care what anybody thinks. I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them.
Which, on the one hand, I suppose I get, because they're really like the closest thing to a band that's universally praised by critics. And we've all seen the endless amount of articles and documentaries fawning over how brilliant they are and how influential they are and the crazy studio techniques they used and blah, 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 all that stuff. And so I get it. You know, sometimes you see so much of that stuff that you want to just be like, you know what? Fuck you. Fuck the Beatles. This band sucks. So in that sense, I get it. But on the other hand, I feel like really this is kind of an edgelord opinion that people say really just to be contrarian. To say like, I don't like the thing everyone else likes. Like for me personally, I wouldn't choose to listen to the Beatles music, although I did like them when I was like 5, not something I would listen to now. But to deny their creativity, their influence, and how much they just generally innovated on rock and pop as an art form, that really just seems like intellectually dishonest to me. Like the songwriting craft on both their pop stuff, the like more early straightforward kind of stuff like Twist and Shout and whatnot, but especially their more progressive, weird stuff that they did later on like Sgt. Pepper's or Magical Mystery Tour. Like, I think you just can't deny that. This is just objectively very well done music. And it's popular for a reason.
Strawberry fields forever.
If you haven't, put on a pair of headphones and really listen to this stuff. There's so many cool details to these arrangements, so many like layers of harmony and just cool little things going on that even if you don't like their music, I think you'll appreciate just as an example of great craft and attention to detail. Really groundbreaking stuff that, at least to me, still sounds great to this day, even if it's not something that I would personally choose to listen to. So in the case of the Beatles, I would say the hype is real. But at the same time, I also get that hearing people gush about the Beatles for like 60 years now is kind of annoying, so I do understand the urge to hate on them. And next up, another one that I was kind of surprised to see on this list is AC/DC. Not because I think AC/DC is great, I definitely don't, but because of the definition of overrated. Like, in order to be overrated, it sort of inherently means that a band has to have tons of people hyping them up and saying they're so great and elevating them to this godlike status. And who is saying that about AC/DC in 2022? Like, maybe in 1985, maybe, but in 2022?
Dirty deeds, done like cheap. Dirty deeds, done like cheap.
Like, the last time I really remember AC/DC being relevant was when I was in 7th grade, which was like 1990, when the scary stoner kids with their crappy little mustaches who would go smoke outside the wood shop when they skipped class would wear AC/DC shirts around school. Like, that was the last time I really thought about AC/DC. So I'm pretty old, and even for me, AC/DC is really before my time in terms of relevance. And so on the one hand, I will agree that the band kind of sucks and they've been essentially making the same album for like 40 years now, but they don't really fit the definition of overrated, because unless you're hanging out with like 55-year-olds, I don't really think anybody likes or even thinks about AC/DC at all. So in that sense, I don't really think we can call them overrated, simply because I don't think anybody is rating them in the first place. Which brings us to the next band, what I think of as the AC/DC of progressive metal or rock or whatever, Tool. Meaning they've kind of been making the same album again and again and again for decades, but people seem to eat it up. I don't know why. This band was suggested by a lot of people, and honestly for good reason. Because we all know the deal, right? Like, I really don't know why. But the Tool fandom is almost like this army of evangelists who have made it their personal life's mission to go around the planet spreading the gospel. The Tool is the most sophisticated, important music on the face of the planet. They'll tell you all about how Tool's Lateralus album is is based on the Fibonacci sequence, even if they don't actually know what the Fibonacci sequence is. They just know that it sounds cool. And they'll go into exhausting detail about all the breadcrumbs and lore and all the Easter eggs on this album that kind of hint at some sort of deep hidden secret buried inside this album. Like they're Nicolas Cage and National Treasure adding up all these clues that'll point them in the direction of this hidden copy of the US Constitution or whatever that movie was about. And honestly, I don't really know if any of that is true, and I kind of don't really care, because the honest truth is that the band is kind of mid. I mean, they certainly don't suck. Even a Tool hater, I think, would admit that the band are phenomenal musicians, and they're super successful. You gotta respect that. But are they really God's gift to music the way that they're like really hardcore, diehard fans would like you to believe? Probably not. So I would have to say that yes, Tool is overrated. But first, I want to thank Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Scentbird is reimagining everything about how people discover, shop for, purchase, and even experience fragrances. Scentbird lets you try a new designer fragrance every month for just $17. And every month you get to pick what you receive, so there are no surprises. They have perfumes and colognes and a lot of unisex options. And with each fragrance, you'll get a 30-day supply, so you can try out fragrances before committing to a full-size bottle. Bottles that can cost $150, and some are even like $300 to $500. You can discover new fragrances by taking a simple quiz on Scentbird. Based on your preferences, previous purchases, and quiz answers, they'll help you find the fragrance that you will love. Scentbird carries Prada, Gucci, Versace, and niche brands like Skylar, Heretic, and Confessions of a Rebel. And so if you want to check it out, make sure that you use my coupon code TPunkRockMBA for 55% off at Scentbird. That works out to just a little bit over $7 for your first month. And note that that is available in the USA and Canada. They sent me a few to check out. For example, this month I got Awaken by Toomey, which is a woody citrus kind of scent, and Maritime Deep Blue by Tommy Bahama, which is like a very fresh, nautical inspired sort of scent. So thanks again to Scentbird for the sponsorship, and remember to check out the links below and use my coupon code. And next up, Radiohead. Another one of those bands who are treated as like God's gift to music by a certain segment of people, especially Radiohead's album Kid A from 2000, which is when they stopped playing relatively straightforward guitar-driven alternative rock and started doing more like ambient, ethereal, experimental kind of stuff.
You can try the best you can. The best you can is good enough.
Which, interestingly enough, was actually not popular at the time. In fact, a lot of people hated this album. My favorite is this review from Melody Maker, which was a very important magazine at the time. It is the sound of Tom York ramming his head firmly up his own ass, hearing the rumblings of his intestinal wind, and deciding to share it with the world. But kind of like with Weezer's album Pinkerton, within a couple years, all of that changed as far as the perception of this album. And it slowly became kind of like the ultimate badge of indie cred. It was eventually declared as the single best album of the 2000s by Pitchfork, and as they put it, the definitive artistic statement for rock consumers born after 1975. And does this album live up to these lofty expectations? Again, I would have to say no. And I get it, it is an interesting album. I had a friend who was obsessed with it. I've listened to this album dozens and dozens of times because of him. There's definitely something there, but to me, this is another case of what I like to call Olive Garden music. And I don't mean music that they would play at Olive Garden. What I mean is music that is sort of the sonic equivalent of Olive Garden. Like if you've never been to a nice restaurant before, you probably think that Olive Garden is fancy. And Radiohead is kind of the musical version of that. Like if you were listening to Weezer and the Foo Fighters the year before Kid A came out, then when you heard Kid A, you probably had your mind blown. Like, holy shit, this is the most amazing thing ever.
Well, it captures your mind and brain and your imagination.
The same way as like if you've eaten a Burger King all your life, you probably felt that way when you had your first tour of Italy at Olive Garden. But on the other hand, if you had been exposed to more genuinely experimental avant-garde music, when you heard Kid A, you were like, yeah, this is all right. Just kind of sounds like background music that they might play at Urban Outfitters. And so would I say that Radiohead are overrated? I would. Another one that came up a lot is Red Hot Chili Peppers, which again, I'm not so sure that I agree with. On the positive side, I actually really love all this band's early stuff, like pretty much everything they've done up to and including Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I've always been a big fan of funk. My mom listened to a lot of that stuff growing up, and I always really appreciated how they combined that with punk in a really cool way that wasn't like as forced as some other bands did it. And I think most people would agree that everybody in every version of the Red Hot Chili Peppers is an absolutely insane musician. Of course, with the exception of Anthony Kiedis, who, let's be real, is just not a great vocalist. Now, with all of that being said, I think everything they've done after Blood Sugar Sex Magic, so basically the last 30 years of their career, has been absolutely awful, but that is actually beside the point. I think they're another case, kind of like AC/DC, where you can't really say that the Red Hot Chili Peppers are overrated, because exactly who was out there singing the praises of this band, right? And next up, another band that I know many of you out there love to the point of worshiping them like it's a religious experience, Deftones. And if you've watched my other videos, then you're probably expecting me to just absolutely dunk on this band. And it's true that I do find this band pretty kind of unremarkable and uninteresting. And their fans drive me insane because they're like the perfect overlap of people who are just a little bit too into weed, nu metal, and shoegaze. Three things that I cannot stand. But putting my own personal taste aside, if I'm being objective here, I've got to give Deftones credit where it's due. I mean, they have 3 platinum albums, 5 that have hit the Billboard Top 10, and they've kind of quietly become one of the most influential metal bands of the past 10 or 15 years, with this whole branch of bands like Loathe and Sleep Token, among many others, citing them as their primary influence, where Deftones core is kind of like almost its own little subgenre. And at the very least, I think you have to give them credit for bringing shoegaze influences into metal, which has become a pretty big thing in the last few years. And so to answer the question, are they overrated? Maybe a little bit, but only because their fans act like the Deftones invented music. I wouldn't say that they're that important, but their weird, annoying fans aside, the band is objectively important and good at what they do, so I gotta give them credit for that. And next up, maybe more of like a general one. Basically, any metal made in the 80s, I respect it, but it's nothing I would recommend for anyone getting into the genre now. This one was interesting, and I gotta say that I kind of agree. I do love Slayer. I still listen to them all the time. But if I'm being honest, really very little music from that time period in any genre is something that I would choose to listen to today. Do I respect it? Absolutely, and I loved a lot of that stuff back in the day. But would I choose to listen to it now or recommend it to someone else? I'm not so sure that I would. For example, as much as I loved a band like Dark Angel back in the day, I'm not sure that if someone asked me for recommendations on what metal bands to listen to now, I don't know that I would recommend it.
So we start this before it goes completely back. More than now, so I should know. You never can look back.
And that's the good stuff, right? Like Dark Angel is one of the best thrash bands of the 80s. If we're being realistic, there is like just so much absolutely terrible metal from the 80s that we sort of tell ourselves it's great because we feel like we're obligated to respect the past or whatever. But let's be honest, it just really does not hold up. But as far as people who cling to that era so much that you're like, does this guy know it's not 1988 anymore? I just don't get that. That was 35 years ago, and there's been a ton of great metal that's come out since then. And I just don't really understand why you'd want to box yourself off like that and sort of deliberately reject so much great music that's come out. And if you sort of do an honest comparison, I don't think very much of that 80s metal stuff sounds great compared to stuff from now or even the 90s. So I would say I have to agree with this one. I do think that 80s metal is overrated. And next up, Imagine Dragons. This is another one that you guys mentioned a lot, but again, I'm not really sure that it makes sense. Not because I think they're so amazing or anything, but it's kind of like AC/DC. Like, who was saying that Imagine Dragons is a great band? Now, they do have 57 million Spotify listeners, listeners, so obviously someone is listening to them, but that doesn't mean the band is overrated. It just means that they're commercially successful. If we kind of look at what does overrated actually mean, it means that there's a difference between how much they're praised by their fans or by critics versus how good they actually are, right? That difference is what defines overrated, not whether their music is actually good or not. For example, a band like Mr. Bungle is overrated because Mike Patton fanboys act like this is the pinnacle of recorded music or maybe even the pinnacle of human artistic achievement in general, when in reality, Mr. Bungle is somewhat interesting in terms of, the various experimental attempts they did at trying something different, but it's not really necessarily great music on its own merits, right? It's kind of like the major label version of what some zany 14-year-old would do in their bedroom if they could play as well as the guys in Bungle can. So again, it's this difference between how good do the fans say they are versus how good they actually are. But with Imagine Dragons, it's actually kind of the opposite. They have been dragged more than any band since Nickelback or Limp Bizkit, and basically designated as this generation's whipping boys, where if you want to show the world that you have quote-unquote good taste in music, you'll say that Imagine Dragons is the worst band on the planet, right? And then everyone will applaud you and be like, oh, you're so right, Imagine Dragons is the worst. Great job, good taste in music guy. I too agree that Imagine Dragons is the worst. Don't we all have great taste? And so when it comes to Imagine Dragons, obviously they aren't the best band in the world. I think we would all agree that they're pretty bland. But are they really that bad? Are they like the worst thing that ever happened to music? I don't think so. So if anything, that might actually mean that Imagine Dragons are underrated. And last but not least, Nirvana. Honestly, I really don't see how anybody could call this band overrated, but they did come up quite a bit when I asked, so let's talk about it. Now, I will concede that Kurt's vocals aren't my favorite. He does get a little bit yarly at times, yarling being like that Eddie Vedder type thing, like rrr, rrr, rrr. Kurt's not quite that bad, but he does a little bit of it. I don't love that. And if you just don't like the band's music, that is fine. You're not obligated to like anything. But objectively speaking, Nirvana really just has so many incredible classic songs that have stood the test of time. That's especially remarkable considering that really all their studio albums came out within a 4-year time span from 1989 to 1993. I mean, what other artist had that much of an impact in just 4 years? And for those of you who are too young to have experienced it firsthand, I was there. I was 13 when Nevermind came out. I grew up in the Seattle area. You've probably heard every rock documentary about the 90s talk about how Nirvana completely changed music overnight. And all that stuff, it might sound overblown, but it's true. They really did change music overnight. The impact of this band really cannot be overstated. Not just in music, but in fashion. I mean, the whole grunge aesthetic that you see all over TikTok now. That is all because of Nirvana. Yes, obviously there's Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, but Nirvana is the band that had the biggest impact by far. And in terms of legacy, if you play Teen Spirit or Come As You Are, even now, 30 years after it came out, everybody's gonna know it, from teenagers to old people. That is just how iconic these songs are. Kurt is still an icon and an inspiration to people of all ages. How many teenagers do you see walking around in Nirvana shirts? Dave Grohl's career on its own has been incredible. To suggest that Nirvana is overrated, that is an opinion that I just cannot get behind. So in conclusion, looking at these picks of the bands that you guys told me were the most overrated, I gotta be honest, as much as I don't like a lot of these bands, I'm not so sure that I would agree that they're overrated. I think for the most part, you guys are just kind of being contrarian. I may not be a huge fan of a lot of these artists personally, but if we're being objective, I think that almost all of these are among the most successful artists in their genre whose influence and impact and songs have really stood the test of time. And it kind of feels like you guys are just trying to talk shit. But that is just my opinion. As always, let me know what you think in the comments of this video. Also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my podcasts a week early. I do giveaways. I do some other cool stuff. There's also a way to have me review your music or artwork or anything else that you want to get my eyes or ears on. All you got to do is join at the $10 and up level. Every month, I do a call for submissions. If you want me to review something, just drop it in the comments of that post. Then I will review it live on Twitch and post it on Patreon for everyone to see. So if that sounds cool, check out the link in the description of this video. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.